Ever think about a dinosaur that couldn't quite figure out what it was?
Huh. Like it had an identity crisis.
Exactly. We're diving into the story of a late Jurassic plant eater, initially called Stegosaurus longispinus,
Right.
then maybe a Kentrosaurus, even briefly, kind of unofficially, Natronsaurus,
Oh, yeah, that one.
and now Alcovasaurus. Quite the journey for a Wyoming native, wouldn't you say?
It really does underscore how our understanding, of the prehistoric world is constantly evolving.
Totally.
This is a prime example of how scientific classification isn't static. It's dynamic, really centered on interpreting the fossil evidence we have.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, we've got a fantastic source that unpacks this whole fascinating history of Alcovasaurus longispinus,
Mhm.
from its discovery right through to the ongoing debates about where it actually belongs on the dinosaur family tree.
Which are still going on, remarkably.
Right. So our mission today is basically to make sense of this paleontological puzzle for you to unravel the name changes, the science behind them.
Yeah, try and clear it up a bit.
By the end, you'll not only know a lot more about this very intriguing dinosaur, but hopefully get a deeper appreciation for the scientific process itself.
Definitely. Okay, let's get into it then.
Let's do it. Where does the story start?
Okay, so we go back to July 1908, Alcova Quarry, Natrona County, Wyoming.
Okay.
The discovery was led by Professors William Harlow Reed and A.C. Dart. They were from the University of Wyoming.
Right.
And what's quite poignant, actually, is that this was Professor Reed's final major dinosaur dig.
Wow, really? His last big one.
Yeah. It kind of highlights how even these individual discoveries have their own historical weight.
Talk about a significant last dig. And the bones, they found it was a pretty good haul for a partial skeleton, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah, definitely. They got, 42 vertebrae,
42? Okay.
a piece of the hip structure, the sacrum and ischia, part of a pubis, a thigh bone, the right femur, several ribs, and crucially, those 4 big dermal tail spines.
Ah, the famous spines.
Those are the ones. So this collection, the Halta-type specimen,
Yeah.
UW2503 originally,
Got it.
that became the basis for the first scientific description.
Yeah.
That was in 1914 by Charles Whitney Gilmore.
Gilmore, right. And he called it Stegosaurus longispinus.
Exactly. And the name Longispinus is pretty descriptive. It's just Latin for long spine.
Makes sense. A clear reference to those tail features.
Absolutely.
And that seems logical, you know? You see long spines, you think Stegosaurus. And it
Yeah.
sounds like for a while that's where it stayed.
Pretty much, yeah. The source mentions other researchers after Gilmore agreed it was a valid Stegosaurus species, mainly because of those spines. So, yeah, initial consensus.
Okay. But then, as often happens, the picture starts to get a little more complicated.
It does. If we jump forward quite a bit to 1993,
Okay.
we see the first kind of major challenge to that original idea. George Olszewski and Tracy Lee Ford proposed something different.
What did they suggest?
They suggested that maybe, just maybe, Stegosaurus longispinus was actually a North American version of the African genus Kentrosaurus.
Kentrosaurus. From Africa. Wow, okay.
Yeah, they proposed the name Kentrosaurus longispinus. The question marks show they weren't entirely sure, some uncertainty there.
Right.
But it shows scientists comparing fossils across continents, looking for those bigger evolutionary connections.
Interesting. So the long spines weren't just a Stegosaurus thing. What kind of evidence were they looking at besides the spines?
That's the key question. At that point, paleontologists were likely, looking really closely at the whole skeleton, not just the flashy bits like the spines.
Right, looking for other shared features.
Exactly. Searching for characteristics it might share with Kentrosaurus, it really emphasizes that classification relies on lots of features, not just one or two obvious ones.
Makes sense.
But the story takes a bit of a sad turn when it comes to the actual fossil itself.
Oh no, what happened to it? Don't tell me it got lost.
Well, almost. Sadly, back in the late 1920s, there was a disaster at the University of Wyoming's museum. Burst water pipes.
Oh, awful. Water damage.
Yeah, major water damage to the specimen. And for a while, people actually thought the whole original set of bones was completely gone. Lost forever.
That's terrible. A paleontologist's worst nightmare.
Totally. It really shows how fragile the fossil record is and how vital, meticulous records and casts become. A real challenge when you're studying the deep past.
So, did anything survive the flood?
Thankfully, yes. One bone made it through. A femur. The thigh bone.
Just the one bone.
Just the one bone from that original holotype collection, still cataloged as part of UW2503. But importantly, we also have plaster casts they made of the rear tail spikes before the accident.
Ah, okay. Cats are crucial then.
Incredibly important. And we also have photos from the excavation and of the skeleton when it was mounted in the museum. So these secondary records became vital when the main physical evidence was compromised.
Absolutely. Wow. So even with that damage, the discussion could continue because of that femur and the casts and photos. Okay, now this next bit, the invalid name, Netronosaurus. Sounds intriguing.
It does, doesn't it? So in 2014, an amateur paleontologist named Roman Ulansky proposed this new genus name, Netronosaurus,
Based on.
based specifically on those long tail spines again. His idea kind of echoed Olszewski and Ford's earlier suggestion, linking it more closely to Kentrosaurus.
So he was basically saying, look, these spines are so different, it needs its own genus, and it's more like Kentrosaurus than Stegosaurus.
That was the gist of it, yeah.
Yeah.
But there's a catch in the scientific world. There are strict rules for naming new species and genera. The International Code of Zoological Nomenclature, the ICZN.
Right, you can't just declare it.
Exactly. Ulansky published the name Netronosaurus in a self-published electronic format. And the problem was, it wasn't independently archived anywhere permanent, and it didn't have an ISSN number that's like a serial number for publications.
Technicalities, but important ones.
Crucial ones. So because it didn't meet those requirements, Netrosaurus isn't considered a valid scientific name. It never officially counted.
So a good idea maybe, but didn't follow the proper channels. It shows science has its procedures.
Precisely. It's not just about the idea, it's about the process and validation.
Got it. Which brings us to 2016. Peter Malcolm Galton and Kenneth Carpenter step in to sort things out officially.
Exactly. They were doing a big revision of stegosaurs, and as part of that, they formally established the genus Alcovasaurus.
Alcovasaurus, named after.
Alcova, Wyoming. A nice, clear nod to where it was found.
Perfect. So Natronosaurus was out, Alcovasaurus was officially in.
That's right. And they also look at another interesting find, a very large, kind of rounded spike base. It was found by a collector, Cliff Miles, in Wyoming back in the 90s.
A round spike base? That sounds different from the long-tail spikes.
It does, yeah. It adds another layer. We don't actually know where that specific fossil is now.
Oh.
But luckily, there's a plaster cast of it. It's cataloged as DMNH333431. So we have evidence suggesting Alcovasaurus might have had different kinds of armor.
Huh. More complexity. But wait, the story doesn't end there, does it? 2019, another reclassification attempt.
Here we go again. Yes, in 2019, Francisco Costa and Octavio Mateus argued something else.
What was their take?
They argued that Alcovasaurus wasn't actually distinct enough from Miragaia.
Miragaia, the long-necked stegosaur from Portugal.
That's the one. They just described a new, pretty complete tail of Miragaia longicolum. And based on that, they argued that many of the features supposedly unique to Alcovasaurus were actually present in Miragaia, too.
So they're saying the differences weren't significant enough to warrant a separate genus?
Essentially, yes. They concluded they shared so many similarities, especially within the tail region once they had this new Miragaia tail, that they should be in the same genus.
And since Miragaia was named first?
Miragaia has naming priority, so they formally renamed Alcovasaurus longispinus as Miragaia longispinus.
Wow, so it gets officially named Alcovasaurus, and then just 3 years later, it's sunk into Miragaia. That's a big shift.
It was. And it tied into this growing understanding, or maybe reevaluation, of the Decenturini subfamily of stegosaurs, which includes Decenturius and Miragaia.
Okay, the plot thickens. But the outline mentioned a latest twist in 2024 I'm almost afraid to ask.
Well, the scientific story keeps unfolding. The very latest development involves a newly described specimen of Decenturus found in Spain.
Okay, another Decenturine. And
This new research suggests that actually Alcovasaurus probably is a distinct genus after all.
back to Alcovasaurus again.
Potentially, yes. And even more intriguingly, the research implies that Miragaia itself might be what they call a subjective junior synonym of Decenturus.
Whoa, wait. So Miragaia might not be its own valid genus either, but just another species of Decenturus.
That's the implication. Basically saying Miragaia and Decenturus might be the same genus, and since Decenturus was named way earlier, that name takes precedence.
Good grief. So the pendulum swings right back. If this latest research holds up, Miragaia gets absorbed into Decenturus and Alcovasaurus gets its independence back.
That seems to be the current thinking, yes. It perfectly demonstrates how one new fossil find can completely reshuffle our understanding of who's related to whom.
Incredible. This constant back and forth is just, wow. It's the scientific process in action.
Absolutely. It's messy, but it's how science advances.
Okay, so let's pivot a bit. Forget the name changes for a second. What did Alcovasaurus actually look like? What do we know about its physical characteristics?
Right. So, based on the fossils, it was a fairly large animal, estimated length around 6.5 meters, that's about 21 feet,
Decent size.
and weight estimates are around 3.5 metric tons, so nearly 4 short tons. Some paleontologists think really big individuals might have even pushed 5 metric tons.
That's a hefty herbivore, not something you'd want to bump into.
Definitely not.
Ugh.
Gilmore measured the thigh bone, the femur, at just over a meter long, 108.2 centimeters, or about 42.6 inches.
And those tail spikes, how long were they really?
The longest preserved spike measured 86 centimeters, that's 34 inches. But Gilmore estimated the original bone core length, before the horny sheath, was probably closer to 98.5 centimeters, nearly 39 inches long.
Almost a meter long. That's impressive.
Very. And Gilmore, back in 1914, noted other features he thought were distinctive, besides the spikes.
What were those?
He mentioned things about the tail vertebrae, the ends, the centra, being rounded when you look at them end-on. He also noted tiny little side projections, vestigial transverse processes on the tail tip vertebrae, and the main body of the vertebrae having sort of mushroom-shaped tops.
Okay, so some quite subtle skeletal details he picked up on.
Yeah, details that contributed to his initial assessment, putting it in Stegosaurus.
And then fast forward to Galton and Carpenter in 2016 when they officially named Alcovasaurus. They listed specific unique features, right? Autapomorphies.
Exactly. Those are the key traits that, in theory, set it apart. They highlighted several things.
Like what?
Okay, so those side processes on the distal, the end, tail vertebrae, the distal tail vertebrae being short but tall, having 2 pairs of really slender and long tail spikes, about 90% of the thigh bone's length.
Wow.
The last spike pair being widest, about a quarter of the way up from the base, and the way the thigh bone connects at the knee, the joint surface being limited to the underside.
Quite specific anatomical points.
Very specific. These are the kinds of details paleontologists use to differentiate species and genera. Crucial evidence.
They also mentioned something about the sacrum, didn't they? The hip vertebrae.
Correct. It seems Alcovasaurus might have had 6 pairs of sacral ribs connecting the sacrum to the hip bones, the ilia.
And that's unusual.
It is for North American Jurassic stegosaurs. Stegosaurus and Hesperosaurus typically have 4 pairs. So if confirmed, that would be another distinguishing feature. Needs more evidence, though.
Okay. And back to the spikes one more time. Gilmore thought something about their relative size was unique, too.
Yes, he reported that the back pair of spikes was the same size as the front pair.
Not smaller, like in other 4-spiked stegos.
Right. Usually the rear pair is shorter. Galton and Carpenter had trouble confirming this for sure from the old photos, but if Gilmore was right, it's another difference. They also suggested the 2 pairs might have been set unusually far apart on the tail.
So not just long, but maybe equally long and widely spaced, which leads us to the big question, what were they for? Galton and Carpenter had an idea.
They did. In their 2016 paper, they leaned towards the spikes being primarily weapons. Defense.
Makes sense.
They pointed to those side projections on the tail vertebrae, suggesting they anchored more muscle mass for powerful sideways swings.
Ah, more power for the thagomizer, basically.
Pretty much. And they suggested the tail itself might have been a bit shorter than in Stegosaurus, maybe a quarter shorter,
Okay.
which could help counteract the twisting forces, the torsion. You get swinging those incredibly long spikes.
Okay, so a shorter, stockier, more muscular tail base designed for weaponized swinging.
That was their interpretation, yeah.
But then Costa and Mateus, with their Miraga comparison, offered a different take based on where they thought it fit in the family tree.
Exactly. Their 2019 reevaluation led to a different functional hypothesis because they placed it within the Dacenturinae.
Mm-hmm.
They suggested it likely had very small tail vertebrae towards the end of the tail, similar to other Dacenturines like Dacentrurus itself, meaning the tail tip probably wasn't heavily muscled or covered in much soft tissue. It might have been much more flexible, almost like a whip.
A whip instead of a club.
Kind of, propelled by strong muscles at the base, but the end part being more flexible and whip-like rather than a rigid, heavily weaponized structure all the way to the tip. Still potentially dangerous, but maybe used differently.
Fascinating. How its perceived relationships change the functional interpretation. Okay, let's just briefly revisit those classification debates. Galton and Carpenter put it in Stegosauridae, but not super close to Kentrosaurus.
Correct. But then, in 2017, Raven and Maidman's analysis threw a bit of a wrench in the works.
How so?
Their phylogenetic study found that the Alcovasaurus specimen seemed to lack a specific fusion in the femur between bony bumps, called trochanters, that you usually see in adult Euripidans. Eurypoda is the bigger group, including stegosaurs and ankylosaurs.
So lacking that fusion made its placement uncertain.
Yeah, it raised questions about whether it was definitively a stegosaur at all based on that particular dataset and character analysis.
And they suggested maybe the specimen wasn't fully grown, a juvenile.
They did raise that possibility, that the lack of fusion could just be because it was immature, but as we said, with most of the original bones gone.
We can't really check that now.
Exactly. So a potentially immature specimen could be misleading the analysis. It's a tricky problem.
Definitely. And then, as we discussed, Costa and Mateus in 2019 went all in, saying it shared enough with De Centaurus or Miragaia to be put in Miragaia.
Yes, they felt the evidence pointed strongly towards it being a Decentauran, specifically Miragaia.
Which brings us, again, full circle to that latest 2024 Spanish De Centaurus paper, potentially reversing that and putting Alcovasaurus back on its own again.
It really does. The whole story of Alcovasaurus is just a fantastic illustration of science and progress.
Absolutely. We've seen it discovered, named as a Stegosaurus, considered maybe a Kentrosaurus, getting an invalid name, getting its own official name, getting sunk into Miragaia, and now maybe becoming independent again, all in just over a century.
It's a whirlwind. But it's a testament to how science works. It's self-correcting, constantly testing ideas with new data.
It's been quite the scientific roller coaster, and I think the key takeaway for you listening is that scientific discovery isn't neat and tidy. It's not a finished book.
Not at all.
It's an ongoing process. Investigation, debate, revision, especially when new evidence pops up. Even things that seem settled, like a dinosaur's name or its place in the family tree, can change.
The story of this one dinosaur really reflects those bigger scientific principles perfectly.
So, thinking about all this, the identity changes, the lost bones, the new finds, it leaves us with a pretty interesting thought, doesn't it?
It does. Considering how incomplete that original fossil was, and how much its classification has shifted based on discoveries of relatives continents away, what else is out there?
Right. What future discoveries, maybe a more complete Alcovasaurus skeleton or another related Decentauran, might completely rewrite the story yet again?
Exactly. The final chapter in the identity crisis of Alcovasaurus. Well, it probably hasn't been written yet. There are almost certainly more surprises waiting underground.